The rain had stopped by 6 in the morning, but the smell hadn't. Damien Gallion descended the stairs to his basement office the way he always did after a long night. Silent, controlled, his footsteps measured against the old oak treads. He expected to find his cleaning crew already at work, the way they always were after nights like the one before. He expected fear. He expected trembling hands and averted eyes. Instead, the basement was empty, except for one woman on her knees. The room reeked of bleach and copper, the two smells that never quite canceled each other out, no matter how much solvent his people used. The Persian rug, the one that had cost more than most people's cars, had been rolled up and dragged toward the incinerator pile in the corner, ruined beyond saving. Dark stains had dried into the grain of the floorboards near the wall, the kind of stains that didn't come out with a single scrubbing. Chloe Jenkins knelt over one of those stains in yellow rubber gloves, a sponge in her hand, her uniform damp with sweat despite the basement's cold. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its bun, sticking to her flushed cheeks. She didn't look up when he entered. She didn't flinch. She just kept scrubbing, her curvy frame bent forward with the kind of quiet, physical effort that came from someone who'd done hard work her whole life and never once complained about it. Damien stood in the doorway and watched her for a long moment. He was used to being feared. He was used to people going still when he entered a room, the way prey goes still when a predator crosses its path. Chloe didn't go still. She simply kept working, as though the man who owned this house, the man half of Boston called the Reaper of the Docks behind closed doors, was no more remarkable than the stain beneath her hands. "Does blood not bother you, Chloe?" he asked finally. She paused, not out of fear, out of consideration, the way someone pauses to actually think about a question instead of rushing to answer it. She looked down at the sponge, at the pink water swirling in the bucket beside her knee. "Blood washes out, Mr. Gallion." She wrung the sponge over the bucket, watching the water darken. "It's the things people do before the bleeding that stay." She went back to scrubbing. Damien didn't move for several seconds. Something in her answer had lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs, a splinter he couldn't immediately name. He had employed dozens of people in this house over the years. Men who feared him, women who flattered him, staff who existed in his peripheral vision like furniture. None of them had ever spoken to him like that. None of them had ever looked at the ugliest part of his world and simply accepted it, the way a nurse accepts a wound. "Where is the rest of the crew?" he asked. "Called out sick, both of them." She didn't look up. "I told Mrs. Ferreira I'd handle it." "You volunteered for this. Someone had to." He studied her a moment longer, the strain in her shoulders, the redness in her knuckles from the bleach, the exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes that no 26-year-old should have. Then he turned and left without another word, because he did not know what to say to a woman who spoke about blood and violence like they were simply Tuesday. He told himself he wouldn't think about her again. He was wrong. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Damien Gallion found himself watching the security footage of his own house not for threats, but for her. He told himself it was diligence. A man in his position couldn't afford blind spots, and somehow this woman, quiet, unremarkable, easily overlooked, had become one. He pulled up the archived footage from the servant's wing camera. One night in his study, a glass of Macallan sweating on the desk beside him, and watched 3 weeks of Chloe Jenkins move through his house like a ghost who never stopped working. She was the first one awake and the last one to leave. She carried linens 2 flights of stairs when the elevator was perfectly functional. She ate her lunch standing at the kitchen counter in under 10 minutes, always facing the door, always alert, and she stole things. Small things, strange things. A bottle of medical-grade antiseptic from the first aid cabinet, rolls of heavy gauze from the same shelf, protein shakes from the pantry, the kind his security team drank after training sessions. Children's fever medicine. Damien blinked at that one, replayed it twice, because there were no children in this house, hadn't been in 3 years, not since. He closed that thought before it could finish forming. Children's vitamins, a discarded wool blanket from the linen closet that was slated to be donated anyway. Soft gray wool with a faded stitched border, the kind of blanket nobody would miss. She never touched the silver. She never touched the jewelry left carelessly on dressers by careless women who came and went from his associates' beds. She never took cash, though there was plenty of it lying around in careless places, the kind of money that would have changed her life. She took things a sick child would need. Damien sat back in his chair, the ice in his glass long melted, and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to a held breath. The next morning he summoned Leo Rossi to his study. Leo had been at his side for 15 years, since before Damien had inherited anything, since the two of them were young men clawing their way up through the ranks of an organization that chewed up the weak and spat out the slow. Leo was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples now, with the kind of easy practiced charm that made him useful in rooms Damien couldn't stand to enter. Damien trusted him the way he trusted very few things in this world, which was to say, cautiously, but completely. "The maid," Damien said without preamble. "Chloe Jenkins." Leo's expression flickered, so briefly Damien nearly missed it. "What about her?" "She's stealing supplies, medical supplies, children's medicine." Something shifted behind Leo's eyes, gone before it could be named. "Could be supplying the O'Rourke leftovers," he said. "They've got wounded men scattered through the old neighborhoods. Wouldn't be the first time somebody on staff got sympathetic to the wrong side, or got paid to be. Bring her downstairs. I'll get it out of her in 20 minutes. "No," Damien said. Leo raised an eyebrow. "I want to know where the supplies are going," Damien said. "Not why. Follow her. Quietly. Report back to me and no one else." "You're taking a personal interest in a maid," Leo said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, something Damien didn't examine closely enough at the time. "I'm taking an interest in a security breach," Damien corrected. "Do your job." Leo left. Damien told himself that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, Damien saw the bruise. Chloe was in the hallway outside the east wing, carrying a stack of folded towels, when her coat sleeve slipped up as she shifted her grip. For just a moment, less than a second, Damien saw the dark purple mark on the pale skin of her forearm, a hand-shaped bruise. Fingers, clearly, wrapped tight enough to leave marks that deep. Someone had grabbed her. Hard. Recently, Damien felt something ignite behind his sternum, sudden and unwelcome and entirely unfamiliar. It took him a moment to identify it, because he hadn't felt real anger, the personal kind, the kind that wasn't calculated, in longer than he could remember. "No one touches people under my roof." The thought arrived fully formed, possessive, in a way that unsettled him more than the bruise itself. He didn't know this woman. She scrubbed his floors and stole his bandages and answered his questions with unsettling calm, and none of that explained why the sight of someone else's hand on her skin made him want to find out whose hand it was and remove it from its owner's body. He said nothing to her. He watched her disappear down the hall, favoring her left leg slightly. A limp she was clearly trying to hide. That evening, when her shift ended, Damien didn't call for his car. He didn't summon his security detail. For the first time in years, he left his own house alone, on foot in the rain, and followed his maid into the dark. Boston in the rain was a city of black cobblestones and orange streetlight halos, the kind of night that swallowed sound and turned every footstep into something private. Damien kept a full block behind Chloe as she walked down from Beacon Hill toward Park Street Station, her canvas bag slung across her body, her head down against the wind. She looked smaller out here, away from the mansion's marble and gold, tired in a way that had nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with an audience. She walked like a woman carrying more weight than the bag on her shoulder. A woman used to carrying things alone. She descended into the tea station. Damien followed, pulling the collar of his coat up, letting the crowd of evening commuters swallow him. He'd worn nothing that marked him as who he was. No security detail trailing 3 steps behind, no tailored coat cut to hide a shoulder holster, just a dark jacket, and the anonymity that came from being one more tired man on the red line. The train was crowded and warm and smelled of wet wool. Chloe found a seat near the window and rested her forehead against the glass, her eyes closing for just a moment. Damien stood 20 feet away, gripping a pole, watching the dark circles under her eyes catch the fluorescent light. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in years. He told himself he was watching a potential informant. He told himself this was reconnaissance. He didn't fully believe himself, and that unsettled him more than anything else that night. The train rattled south, then west, deeper into parts of the city Damien's organization didn't openly control. Old O'Rourke territory, streets that still bore the scars of a war his family had technically won 3 years ago, but never quite finished. Chloe got off at a stop Damien rarely had reason to visit, in a neighborhood of boarded storefronts and buildings waiting for demolition permits that never came. He followed her through streets slick with rain, past chain-link fences and graffiti-tagged brick, his hand resting inside his coat against the weight of his gun. Every step deeper into O'Rourke ground made the picture clearer, uglier, more damning. She's a spy, he thought. She's been feeding information to what's left of the O'Rourkes for God knows how long. He felt something sharp and unexpected beneath the anger, disappointment. He realized, with a kind of horror he didn't examine too closely, that some part of him had hoped he was wrong. Had hoped the woman who spoke about blood without flinching, who stole medicine instead of money, was exactly what she appeared to be. Decent, in a house full of people who weren't. He was prepared to kill her if the truth confirmed his fear. Chloe stopped in front of a condemned 3-story building, its windows boarded, a rusted condemned notice peeling from the door. She glanced both directions, a habit, practiced, careful, and slipped around the side toward a basement entrance hidden behind a stack of broken pallets. Damien waited 30 seconds, then followed. The basement window was low, half-buried, filthy with years of grime. He crouched beside it, wiped a small circle, clear with his sleeve, and looked inside. The scene stopped his heart. A single bare bulb lit a cramped basement room lined with mismatched furniture, a cot, a folding table, shelves of canned food. A man Damien recognized instantly, even after 3 years, knelt on the floor. Tommy Hook Callahan, once one of the O'Rourke family's most feared enforcers, his knuckles scarred, a fresh cut above one eye. Tommy was wrapping gauze, Damien's gauze, stolen from Damien's own first aid cabinet, around Chloe's calf, where an angry red gash marred her skin. On the table beside them, the antiseptic, the protein drinks, the children's medicine. Damien's hand tightened around his gun. His mind assembled the pieces into the only shape that made sense. Chloe had been treating a wounded O'Rourke enforcer, feeding him supplies stolen from Damien's own house, right under his roof, for weeks, maybe longer. He thought of the bruise on her arm and wondered, with a cold and furious clarity, whether Tommy had put it there, or whether it had come from someone else in this network of ghosts he was only now discovering. He drew his weapon. His thumb found the safety. He would open that door, and he would end this. Both of them, quickly, before either could reach for a weapon of their own. It was seconds away. His hand was already on the door handle. Then a small voice cut through the basement, high and clear and utterly unguarded. "Auntie Chloe, did you bring the milk?" Damien froze. A little girl stepped out from behind a stack of boxes, no older than 5 or 6, dark curls tumbling loose around a small, solemn face. She wore an oversized gray wool blanket, wrapped around her shoulders like a cape, the same faded stitched border Damien had watched Chloe steal from his linen closet weeks earlier. The girl looked up at Chloe with wide, bright green eyes. Damien's entire body went cold. He knew those eyes. He had grown up looking into a version of them every day of his childhood. He had watched them close for the last time in his mind 3 years ago, in the wreckage of a car fire that had taken his brother, his sister-in-law, and this exact child from the world. Lily Gallion, his niece, declared dead. Buried, or rather, mourned over an empty casket because there had been nothing left to bury, or so he'd been told. Standing 8 feet away from him, alive. Damien's gun lowered without his permission, his arms suddenly too heavy, too distant, to hold it steady. He stood frozen at the filthy window, watching Chloe pull the girl into her lap, watching her open a protein drink and hand it over, with the kind of gentle, practiced care that came from years of doing exactly this. "I brought the milk," Chloe murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of Lily's dark curls. "And your vitamins. You have to take both, remember." "I know," Lily said, with the exaggerated patience of a child who has said this before. She drank from the straw, then looked at Chloe's bandaged leg, with a frown that seemed far too old for her face. "Did the bad man hurt you again?" "I'm okay, baby." Chloe's voice was steady, but Damien, even through a filthy window, even with his heart in ruins, could hear the exhaustion underneath it, the years of carrying this alone. Tommy finished tying off the bandage and sat back on his heels. "Sweepers were 3 blocks over tonight," he said quietly, glancing toward the boarded window. "One of them clocked you outside the pharmacy last week, Chloe. That's where the bruise came from. Recognized you from 3 years back. Grabbed your arm before you got away. We gotta move again. Soon." Chloe closed her eyes briefly, like a woman absorbing one more weight onto an already collapsing frame. "I promised her mother," she said, so quietly Damien had to strain to hear it. "Before she died. I promised her. If anything happened, I would keep this child safe, whatever it cost me. They will reach her through my body first. That's not negotiable, Tommy." Damien stood outside the window, with rain running down the back of his neck, his gun forgotten at his side, and felt something inside his chest that had been dead for 3 years crack open like ice, giving way beneath spring water. Every stolen item, every late shift, every bruise, every limp, every exhausted line on her face. None of it had been for herself. It had all been for his family. He didn't remember crossing to the basement door. He remembered his fist against the wood, 3 slow knocks, deliberate enough not to sound like an attack. Inside, he heard Tommy swear and the scrape of a shotgun being raised. "It's Gallion," Damien said through the door, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'm alone. I'm not here to hurt anyone." Silence. Then the door cracked open, and Tommy's shotgun met him at eye level. Both barrels steady despite the tremor Damien could see in the man's jaw. "Take one more step," Tommy said, "and I put you in the ground next to your brother." "Tommy," Chloe's voice, sharp and urgent from somewhere behind him. "Wait." Damien raised both hands slowly, empty palms visible, and stepped into the light. His eyes found Chloe immediately. She had risen despite her injured leg, and she moved between Damien and the child with a swiftness that made his chest ache, positioning her own body as a wall between the most dangerous man in Boston and the little girl behind her. For the first time since he'd met her, Chloe looked at him with fear. Not calculated caution, not professional restraint. Genuine animal fear. The kind that comes from a woman who has spent 3 years protecting a child from powerful men, and who now believed one of the most powerful men in the city stood in her doorway with the power to end everything she'd sacrificed for. "Please," she said, and her voice cracked on the word in a way he hadn't heard before. "Whatever you think this is, please, just listen before you. Chloe." Damien's own voice broke slightly, unfamiliar to his own ears. He lowered himself, slowly, deliberately, to one knee, until he was eye level with the child peeking out from behind Chloe's legs, one small hand fisted in the fabric of Chloe's skirt. Lily stared at him with those unmistakable Gallion eyes, wary and unblinking. "Are you one of the bad men?" she asked. Something in Damien's chest tore wide open. "No, sweetheart." His voice came out barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not." He swallowed hard, fighting something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 years. Not since he'd stood beside an empty casket. And told himself grief was a luxury men in his position couldn't afford. "I'm your Uncle Damien." The room went utterly silent. Lily's small face crumpled in confusion, searching his features for something familiar, something her 3-year-old memory might have kept. And then Damien, the reaper of the Boston docks, the man who had once shot a man in the kneecap for being 5 minutes late, put his face in his hands and wept, kneeling on a filthy basement floor, in front of a woman who had every reason to fear him and a child he had believed. The world had already stolen from him, forever. It took nearly an hour before anyone could speak in full sentences. Tommy set the shotgun down, though he kept it within reach. Chloe eventually convinced Lily to go back to the cot with a coloring book out of earshot while the adults talked. Damien sat on an overturned crate, his knees still weak, watching Chloe change the dressing on her leg, with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since he'd knocked on that door. "Start from the beginning," Damien said. "All of it." Chloe glanced at Tommy. Tommy's jaw tightened. "I planted the bomb," Tommy said flatly. "Might as well say it plain since you're gonna find out anyway." Damien's whole body went rigid. His hand found the edge of the crate, gripping until his knuckles whitened. "O'Rourke told me Liam would be alone in the car," Tommy continued, his voice hollow. A man reciting a confession he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in his own head. "Just Liam. That's what I was told. I didn't know about the car seat until I was already watching the vehicle from across the street, and by then it was too late to call it off. O'Rourke had eyes on me too, making sure I finished the job." His hands trembled. First charge went off under the engine block. I ran toward the car soon as the smoke cleared, because there was a second device set for the fuel line. 90 seconds behind the first. I had 90 seconds. He looked at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. I pulled the kid out through the back window. Liam and Nora were already gone. I couldn't do anything for them. God as my witness, I tried. But the girl was alive. Barely. I had 90 seconds before that car turned into a fireball, and I made the only choice I could live with. You couldn't take her to a hospital, Damien said slowly, understanding dawning like a blade. O'Rourke had cops on payroll watching every ER in a 20-mile radius, in case anybody survived that they needed to finish off, Tommy said. A burned kid shows up anywhere official. She's dead within the week, and so am I. I knew one person who wouldn't ask questions and knew enough medicine to keep a child alive without a hospital. His eyes moved to Chloe. I'd treated Tommy's sister 2 years earlier, Chloe said quietly, taking up the story. Pediatric burns, respiratory trauma from a house fire. I was ICU trauma nursing at Boston General back then. He remembered me. Showed up at my apartment at 2 a.m. with a burned, barely breathing 3-year-old wrapped in his jacket and asked me to save her life without asking a single question about who she was. And you did, Damien said. I did. Chloe's hazel eyes met his, steady despite everything. 3rd-degree burns on her left side. Smoke damage to her lungs. She stopped breathing twice in the first 48 hours. I treated her in my own bathtub, with supplies I stole from the hospital pharmacy, because admitting her meant signing paperwork that would have gotten her killed. Damien's throat worked, and when O'Rourke found out a child might have survived, they burned my apartment to the ground 3 weeks later, Chloe said, her voice flattening with old, controlled pain. Filed anonymous complaints against my nursing license. Falsified drug diversion reports. Patient neglect claims that never happened. My license was suspended pending investigation within a month. My career, gone. My home, gone. I disappeared with a critically injured child, and a man the O'Rourkes considered a loose end, and we have been running ever since. Shelters, church basements, condemned buildings like this one. 3 years. Damien sat in silence, absorbing the full architecture of what she'd sacrificed, feeling something close to reverence mix with the grief still raw in his chest. Why my house? He asked finally. Why work as my maid, of all things? Chloe held his gaze without flinching, and for the first time, Damien saw the steel underneath her softness. The thing that had let her do all of this, alone, for 3 years. To find out whether you killed your brother, she said. The words landed like a physical blow. You inherited the entire Gallion empire the week Liam died, Chloe continued, unflinching. From the outside, that's motive with a bow on it. I needed to know with my own eyes whether the man Lily's mother died protecting her from was the same man who might have ordered the hit. I couldn't bring that little girl home to a monster, Mr. Gallion. Not even if that monster shared her blood. And now, Damien's voice was barely above a whisper. What have you decided? Chloe was quiet for a long moment, studying his tear-streaked face, the raw devastation he'd made no attempt to hide from her. Now I think you're a dangerous man who just found out the worst thing that ever happened to him wasn't entirely true, she said. That's not the same as innocent, but it's not the same as guilty, either. Damien absorbed that. He found, to his own surprise, that he respected her more for refusing to simply hand him absolution. You protected her from everyone, he said. Even me. Especially you, Chloe said. You were the one with the most to lose if she turned out to be inconvenient. The bullet came without warning, tearing through the bare bulb overhead and plunging the basement into darkness a half-second before the sound of the shot reached them. Down. Tommy roared, diving for the shotgun. Chloe moved before Damien's brain had finished registering the threat. She was across the room in the dark, scooping Lily off the cot and pressing the child's face into her shoulder, shielding her small body with her own, murmuring something low and steady into her ear that sounded less like panic and more like a rehearsed drill, the kind of calm that only came from having done this before. Gunfire erupted outside the basement door. Automatic weapons, at least 3 shooters by Damien's count, the unmistakable chaos of an O'Rourke sweep team that had finally, catastrophically, found what they'd been hunting for 3 years. Damien drew his weapon and moved to the doorway, firing controlled bursts into the darkness beyond, years of training taking over where grief had briefly stolen his edge. Tommy fought beside him, the 2 men, enemies for a decade, allies for exactly 9 minutes, laying down cover fire in the narrow basement stairwell while Chloe pulled Lily toward the back of the room. "There's an old coal chute," Chloe called over the gunfire, her voice remarkably level. "Leads into the storm drain system. I mapped it the first week we moved in here." "Go," Damien barked. "Now, take her and go." "I'm not leaving you two to die in a basement," Chloe snapped back, already dragging a rusted grate away from the wall with her free hand, while balancing Lily on her hip. "I am the boss of the Gallion Syndicate," Damien said, ducking as a spray of bullets chewed through the wall beside him. "You will obey me." Chloe fixed him with a look that, even in the near darkness, could have stripped paint. "I don't work for you down here," she said. "I protect Lily, and Lily needs her uncle alive, so you're going to cover me while I get her into this tunnel, and then you and Tommy are going to follow. Or so help me God, I will come back into this gunfight and drag you both out myself. Move." Damien stared at her for exactly 1 stunned second. No one, not his father, not Leo, not a single soul in 15 years of blood and violence, had ever spoken to him like that. And then he moved, because some primal part of him recognized that she was right, and that arguing further would get someone he'd only just found again killed. They fled through the coal chute into the storm drains beneath the neighborhood, freezing water at their ankles. Lily's face buried against Chloe's shoulder, Tommy bringing up the rear with the shotgun. Damien pressed a small emergency transponder hidden in his coat lining, a device he'd never once needed to use in 3 years of carrying it, and within 11 minutes, the beam of tactical flashlights cut through the tunnel darkness ahead of them. Leo Rossi emerged first, flanked by 6 of Damien's best men, weapons drawn, expressions grim. "Boss." Leo's eyes swept the scene. Damien soaked and bloodied at the shoulder from a graze, Tommy Callahan of all people standing beside him with a shotgun, Chloe drenched and shaking with a small child clinging to her neck. Leo's gaze landed on Lily. For half a second, less, almost imperceptible in the flashlight beams, something moved behind Leo Rossi's eyes. Not surprise, not relief. Something colder, calculating, quickly smoothed away beneath a professional mask of concern. "Jesus," Leo said, recovering instantly. "Is that?" "Get everyone to the mansion," Damien said, his voice raw. Now, Chloe saw it. She saw the flicker cross Leo's face, filed it away the way a nurse files away an anomaly on a chart that doesn't fit the diagnosis yet. Damien, exhausted and half-destroyed by grief and adrenaline, did not. It was a mistake that would nearly cost them everything. The Beacon Hill mansion changed in ways no one could have predicted. Within a week, the sterile marble halls had sprouted small, absurd rebellions against Damien's carefully controlled aesthetic. A nightlight shaped like a moon plugged into the hallway outlet outside the guest room, now occupied by a small girl with green eyes and a wool blanket she refused to let anyone wash. Children's books stacked on the mahogany side table in the library, spines cracked from repeated reading. A stuffed brown bear, ragged and clearly beloved, that traveled with Lily from room to room like a small, threadbare shadow. Damien had no idea how to interact with a child. He approached the problem the way he approached everything else. With resources. He had an antique porcelain doll, shipped in from a specialty collector in New York, hand-painted, dressed in silk, worth more than most cars. Lily looked at it for exactly 4 seconds before setting it gently aside and returning her full attention to her ragged stuffed bear. "She doesn't like it," Damien said to Chloe that evening, genuinely baffled, standing in the doorway of Lily's new bedroom, like a man who had lost a negotiation he didn't understand the terms of. "She likes the bear," Chloe said, not looking up from the storybook she was reading aloud to a half-asleep Lily. The bear was with her the night of the fire. Tommy grabbed it out of the wreckage without even thinking about it. It's the only thing she has from before. Damien absorbed this. The next day, he ordered 12 identical stuffed bears from every toy retailer in the state, as though sheer quantity might solve a problem rooted in sentiment. Chloe found him standing in the nursery, surrounded by a small army of brown bears, looking utterly lost, and something in her chest ached at the sight of the most dangerous man in Boston defeated by a 5-year-old's grief. "Damien." She said his first name without thinking, and neither of them commented on it. "She needs an uncle, not a purchasing department." Damien looked at the bears, then at her, something almost sheepish crossing his hardened features. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. It might have been the first honest thing he'd said to anyone about his own limitations in years. "Then sit on the floor," Chloe said, "and let her show you how her bear likes to have tea parties. That's the whole trick. Nobody actually knows how to do this. You just show up small enough for a 5-year-old to teach you." Later that night, Damien found himself cross-legged on the nursery floor, pouring imaginary tea from a plastic teapot into cups. Lily insisted the bears absolutely required, and felt something in his chest unknot for the first time. In 3 years, he almost smiled. Chloe, watching from the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression she quickly schooled into neutrality, noticed. She said nothing, but something warm had settled behind her ribs that she wasn't ready to name yet either. Chloe was no longer treated as a maid, though she resisted every attempt to formally change that fact. Damien ordered her moved to one of the guest suites. Chloe refused, insisting on staying in the smaller room adjoining Lily's, close enough to hear if the girl woke screaming from the nightmares that still visited her some nights. Memories of fire and smoke that a 5-year-old shouldn't carry but did. Damien ordered her to rest, citing her leg injury, still healing beneath fresh bandages. Chloe ignored him and kept working anyway, changing Lily's dressings, managing her medication schedule, sitting up with her, through nightmares, functioning on the same brutal 3 years of exhausted vigilance she'd never truly set down. Damien found himself fascinated by her in ways he didn't fully understand, and didn't entirely try to stop. He learned, slowly, in fragments she offered only when she trusted the moment, about the scar along her ribs from when Tommy had once pulled her through a broken window during an earlier close call. About the year they'd spent sleeping in a church basement in Dorchester, taking turns keeping watch. About the letter she'd written to her own mother, a woman she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, who believed her daughter had simply vanished, maybe dead, maybe worse, and never once mailed, because the risk to Lily was too great. He began to understand, piece by piece, that the exhausted woman who had scrubbed blood from his floorboards without flinching had been quietly, invisibly, keeping his entire family alive while his staff mocked the sound of her footsteps on the stairs. The shame of it settled into him like a stone. One evening, passing through the kitchen, he overheard one of his household staff, a young woman named Priya, who managed the linen inventory, laughing with another maid about the cow finally getting a promotion, probably flat on her back for it, referring to Chloe's new elevated status in the household. Damien fired her on the spot, in front of the entire staff, his voice a low and terrible thing that made the kitchen go silent. Chloe found out within the hour. She confronted him in his study, arms crossed, jaw tight. "I don't need you to destroy everyone who hurts my feelings," she said. "I know," Damien said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "Then why did you do it?" He finally met her eyes. Something raw and unguarded moved across his face, an admission he hadn't planned to make. "I wanted to," he said simply. Chloe held his gaze for a long moment, something complicated passing behind her hazel eyes, irritation warring with something warmer, something she wasn't ready to examine. "That's not the same as being right," she said finally. But there was less heat in it than before, and when she left the study, Damien found himself watching the door long after it had closed, cataloging things about her he had never once let himself notice about anyone. The warmth in her hazel eyes when she looked at Lily, the soft curve of her face when she laughed, rare but real when it happened. Her hands, strong and capable, scarred faintly from years of medical work and years of running. Hands that had kept a dying child breathing in a bathtub with stolen supplies. The curves of her body that she never apologized for, never shrank from, that moved through his cold marble halls with a warmth the house had been missing for years. The way she became something close to fierce whenever Lily needed protecting. The absolute unshakable way she refused to fear him, even now. Even knowing exactly what he was capable of. He did not know, yet, that he was falling in love with her. He only knew that the house felt different when she was in it, and hollow in the moments she wasn't. Tommy stayed in a guarded wing of the mansion, half prisoner, half guest, cooperating fully with an investigation. Damien had launched the moment. The shock of Lily's survival had faded enough for rage to take its place. "Somebody inside your organization fed O'Rourke everything," Tommy told Damien. Sitting across a table in the room Damien had converted into a war room. They knew Liam's route down to the minute. They knew the security rotation changed that week. They knew the vehicle swap. Hell, they knew which car he'd be in before he did. That's not luck. That's somebody with access to your father's inner circle. "My father's dead," Damien said. Liam ran security logistics himself. Only a handful of people had that kind of access. "Then start with the handful," Tommy said. Leo, when consulted, was characteristically dismissive of the theory. "You're letting a former enforcer who admits to planting the bomb tell you who to trust," Leo said one afternoon in Damien's study, pouring himself a drink without asking. "Kill him and be done with it, Damien. He's manipulating you and the girl both. Christ knows what he's whispering to Chloe when you're not around." "He saved Lily's life," Damien said flatly. After trying to end it, Leo shot back. "I've served this family 15 years. I watched you bury your brother. Don't let some ghost from 3 years ago and his pet nurse rearrange your priorities." Something about the phrase "his pet nurse" made Damien's jaw tighten, though he couldn't fully articulate why. Chloe, for her part, had begun to grow quietly suspicious of Leo from the night in the storm drain. The flicker she'd seen cross his face when he first laid eyes on Lily. The calculation, quickly hidden, that didn't match a man simply relieved to find his boss's family alive. She began investigating on her own, careful and methodical, using the trauma nurse instincts that had once made her exceptional at spotting the details other people missed. She started with the false complaints that had destroyed her nursing license 3 years earlier. Anonymous filings, a shell company that had funded the smear campaign against her. It took her 4 days of careful digging through public business filings, cross-referenced late at night, on a laptop in the mansion's library, to trace the shell company's original incorporation documents to a registered agent address that connected, through 2 additional layers of paperwork, to a property management firm quietly owned, in part, by Leo Rossi. Her hands were shaking when she brought the printouts to Damien. "I need you to look at this," she said. Damien read through the documents, his expression darkening with every page. This could be coincidence. Leo owns dozens of properties across the city. It's how he launders half our Damien. Chloe's voice was steady, cutting through his instinct to defend a man he'd trusted for 15 years. "You followed me because something didn't make sense. A maid, stealing children's medicine instead of jewelry. You trusted that instinct enough to put your own life at risk in a condemned building in enemy territory. Now I'm asking you to do the same thing with him." Damien stared at the papers for a long moment, torn between 15 years of loyalty and the cold, uncomfortable logic Chloe had laid in front of him. "I'll look into it," he said finally, quietly. "If you're wrong, this ends here and we never speak of it again. And if I'm right?" Damien's expression hardened into something Chloe had only glimpsed once before, in a basement doorway, with a shotgun aimed at his chest. "Then Leo Rossi has been sitting at my table for 15 years while helping murder my brother," he said. "And I will handle that personally." Leo moved faster than either of them expected. He'd suspected Chloe's growing suspicion for days. The careful questions she'd asked one of his junior accountants. The way she'd started watching him during family meetings with something colder than her usual careful courtesy. By the time Damien began his quiet investigation, Leo had already begun constructing his defense. It took him less than a week to manufacture what he needed. Security footage appeared, expertly altered, time-stamped to suggest Chloe meeting secretly with Tommy in a downtown parking structure, exchanging what looked like a manila envelope. Financial records surfaced, showing a series of transfers into an account bearing Chloe's name, routed through an offshore intermediary. Encrypted messages, planted on a burner phone, traced back to Chloe's old apartment building, suggested she'd been negotiating to sell Lily's location to a buyer whose identity remained conveniently obscured. Leo brought the evidence to Damien personally, his face a careful mask of reluctant duty. "I didn't want to believe it either," Leo said, laying the documents across Damien's desk. "But you asked me to be thorough. This is what thorough found." Damien's world tilted on its axis. 3 years of buried betrayal trauma, the belief, forged in the fire of his brother's death, that everyone eventually sold out everyone else, surged back to the surface with terrible force. He confronted Chloe that evening in the library. The manufactured evidence spread across the table between them like an accusation made physical. "Explain this," he said, his voice a stranger's, cold in a way it hadn't been with her in weeks. Chloe looked at the documents, her face draining of color as understanding dawned. "This is fabricated," she said. "Damien, I have never met Tommy in a parking garage. I don't have an offshore account. I don't even know how to open one. The footage is doctored. I don't know how, but it is." Her voice cracked, devastation bleeding through the fear. 3 years. Her hands trembled where they gripped the edge of the table. I gave 3 years of my life to that child. I lost my career, my home, my mother's trust, everything I was, protecting her. And you think, after everything, you think I would sell her. I need proof, Damien said, and hated himself for saying it even as the words left his mouth. Hated the way 3 years of paranoia had built a fortress in him that even Chloe hadn't fully torn down. Chloe's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "No," she said quietly. "You need courage." She held his gaze, unflinching even now. The courage to trust someone when fear tells you not to. You had it in that basement, Damien. You knelt down and let a 5-year-old ask if you were one of the bad men, and you told her the truth even though it broke you open. Find that same courage now. For me. Damien said nothing. The silence stretched, ugly and irreversible, and something in Chloe's face closed like a door. That night she disappeared. By morning, Damien had convinced himself she'd run, fled with whatever she'd stolen, whatever deal she'd struck. Proof at last of the betrayal his instincts had warned him about for 3 years. He told himself the ache in his chest was rage. He told himself the emptiness of the house, without her moving through it, meant nothing. Then Lily tugged at his sleeve at breakfast, her small face solemn. "Auntie Chloe gave me this to keep safe," she said, holding out a thin medical alert bracelet, the kind nurses wore for allergy identification. "She said if she ever had to go away fast, I should give it to you and only you." Damien's hands shook as he turned the bracelet over. A tiny compartment, nearly invisible, had been built into the clasp. Inside, no bigger than a fingernail, sat a micro-storage chip. He plugged it into his laptop, with hands that had gone numb. Files unspooled across the screen. Chloe's entire investigation, meticulously documented. The shell company, the registered agent address. Leo's ownership stake, buried 3 layers deep but undeniable once traced. Bank records she'd somehow accessed, showing payments from Leo's accounts to a fixer known for producing exactly the kind of falsified evidence that had just destroyed Damien's trust in her. She hadn't run. She'd been building a case against Leo the entire time, hiding it in the one place she knew Damien would eventually find it, if the worst happened. Damien's blood turned to ice. She hadn't run at all. She'd been taken. Leo held her in an abandoned medical supply warehouse near Boston Harbor, the kind of building that had once processed shipments before the docks contracted and left half the waterfront hollow and forgotten. Chloe sat bound to a metal chair beneath a bank of dead fluorescent lights, her leg throbbing where the old injury had reopened during the struggle of her abduction, her wrists raw from the zip ties. Leo paced in front of her, his easy charm entirely gone now, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. "Where did Tommy hide the original evidence?" Leo demanded. "The bombing files, the route information. I know he kept a copy somewhere, insurance in case O'Rourke ever turned on him." "I don't know," Chloe said, and it was the truth, though she doubted Leo would believe it. Leo struck her across the face, hard enough to split her lip. Chloe's head snapped sideways, but when she straightened, her eyes were dry and steady, fixed on him with something closer to pity than fear. "You're a maid," Leo spat. "A fat, forgettable little maid who got lucky enough to stumble into a dead family's secret. You have no idea what you've walked into." Chloe spit blood onto the concrete floor and looked up at him. "You made the same mistake Damien did," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "You looked at me and saw someone invisible, someone who wouldn't notice, wouldn't matter, wouldn't fight back." She smiled, thin and bloody. "You were wrong both times." Leo's composure cracked. Liam was going to clean house, he snarled, pacing again, the confession spilling out of him now like something he'd needed to say for 3 years. He found out I'd been skimming shipments through the union contracts for a decade. Millions, Chloe. Millions I built with my own hands while his family sat on top of an empire they inherited. He was going to expose me, hand me over to his own brother for judgment. I wasn't going to lose everything I'd built because Liam Gallion suddenly grew a conscience. So you gave O'Rourke his route, Chloe said quietly. I gave them everything, Leo said. The route, the rotation, the vehicle swap. I made sure the story about the O'Rourkes acting alone held together afterward. I made sure the paperwork on a surviving child never crossed anyone's desk who might ask questions. And when I heard 3 years later that some maid in Damien's own house was stealing pediatric medication, his laugh was ugly. I've been hunting that girl for 3 years, and it turns out she was scrubbing Damien's floors the entire time. Beautiful, really. Chloe kept his attention fixed on her, her fingers working quietly at the small medical pager clipped inside her sleeve. Modified months earlier, in a moment of paranoid foresight she'd never expected to need, into a crude recording device. You destroyed my career, she said, keeping her voice steady, keeping him talking. You burned my home. I did what was necessary, Leo said, his composure returning as the confession ran its course. You murdered Damien's brother, she pressed, his wife. You've spent 3 years hunting a 5-year-old child to finish the job. I did, Leo said flatly, no longer bothering to deny it, secure in the belief that the walls of an abandoned warehouse would carry his words no further than the woman tied to this chair, who he fully intended to make sure never spoke again. The recording captured every word. Damien arrived at the warehouse 40 minutes later, alone at first, then flanked by loyal men he'd gathered in the frantic hour since discovering the truth on Chloe's hidden chip. Tommy had insisted on coming, armed and grim, ready to expose whatever remained of Leo's protection inside the building. They moved through the warehouse's outer perimeter in near silence, Tommy taking down 2 of Leo's men with brutal efficiency before they'd even registered the threat. Damien pressed forward, his blood a roaring static in his ears, until he reached the loading bay, where Leo stood behind Chloe's chair, a gun pressed to the back of her skull. Damien. Leo's voice was almost pleasant, as though they were discussing shipping manifests rather than a hostage situation. I was hoping we'd get to talk before this went any further. Let her go, Damien said, his own weapon leveled and steady, despite the fury threatening to consume him whole. She's a maid, Leo said. A means to an end that got complicated. Choose the empire, Damien. Choose 15 years of loyalty over a woman who scrubbed your floors. Walk away, and we can rebuild whatever this cost us. Damien's eyes found Chloe's across the warehouse floor. Bruised, bloodied, terrified for herself for the first time since he'd known her, and yet still, even now, watching him with something that looked almost like faith. She protected my family when my empire failed them, Damien said, his voice carrying across the empty warehouse like a verdict. She kept the last piece of my brother alive for 3 years, while you hunted a child for the crime of surviving your greed. There is no version of my empire worth more than that, Leo. There never was. Tommy moved through the shadows behind Leo's remaining men, taking them down with the quiet, brutal efficiency of a man who had once been the best enforcer in the O'Rourke organization. Damien advanced, his focus narrowing entirely onto Leo and the gun still pressed against Chloe's skull. You'll never make it out of this building, Leo said, his composure finally beginning to fracture. "I don't care," Damien said, and meant it completely. Leo's finger tightened on the trigger, not aimed at Chloe any longer, but swinging wide toward Damien himself, a final, desperate shot meant to end this on his own terms. Chloe saw the movement a half-second before anyone else registered it. She threw her bound body sideways, directly into Leo's line of fire, putting herself between the bullet and the man she'd spent weeks learning to trust, despite every instinct screaming at her not to. The shot caught her in the shoulder. Damien's roar tore through the warehouse as he closed the remaining distance in a heartbeat, his own weapon finding Leo before the older man could fire again. It ended in seconds. Violent, final, the kind of ending that came for men who had spent their lives believing themselves untouchable. Damien didn't watch it. He was already on his knees, catching Chloe as she collapsed sideways out of the chair, blood spurting fast and dark through her shirt, her face going pale in his arms. "Stop," he said, his voice breaking apart entirely, pressing his hand against the wound with a desperation that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with terror. "Stop saving Gallions. Stop it. You don't owe us this." Chloe's eyes fluttered, finding his through the fog of pain and blood loss. And even now, even bleeding out in his arms on a warehouse floor, something like amusement flickered across her bruised face. "Then stop needing it," she whispered. Before the world went dark around her, she survived. The bullet had missed anything vital by less than an inch. A fact the trauma surgeon repeated to Damien 3 separate times in the hospital corridor, as though the specificity of the miracle needed emphasizing to a man who hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't left the waiting room in over 18 hours. Damien sat beside her hospital bed for 3 days, through the fog of anesthesia and the slow climb back to consciousness, his hand wrapped around hers, even when the machines beeped and the nurses came and went, and Lily was brought in twice a day to sit quietly beside him, drawing pictures of the two of them, together with crayons that never quite stayed within the lines. When Chloe finally woke fully on the 3rd day, groggy but lucid, Damien was the first thing she saw. "You look terrible," she said, her voice hoarse. "You got shot protecting a man who accused you of selling out a child you spent 3 years saving." Damien said, "I think I'm allowed to look terrible." Chloe managed a weak smile, then winced against the pull of the stitches in her shoulder. Damien's expression sobered, the weight of everything he'd carried in silence for 3 days finally spilling out. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to make big enough," he said quietly. "You were in my house every day for weeks. You carried my family through hell while I let my staff mock you, while I doubted you the moment fabricated evidence gave me an excuse to. I treated you like furniture, Chloe. Like something that existed to serve this house, rather than the woman who kept its most precious thing alive." Chloe was quiet for a long moment, studying him. "You noticed eventually," she said finally. "Too late," Damien said, the words raw. "Then do better," Chloe said, "with the time you have left." Damien spent the following weeks correcting what could be corrected. He hired the city's best legal team to formally expose Leo's fabricated evidence and the false complaints that had destroyed Chloe's nursing career 3 years earlier. The truth, once properly documented and presented, moved through the bureaucratic machinery of the state nursing board with unusual speed for a man with Damien's resources behind the effort. Chloe's license was fully reinstated. Within 2 months, her record cleared, her name restored. But Damien did not decide what came next for her. He'd learned that lesson too thoroughly to make that mistake again. He offered her choices instead. A position within Gallion Holdings if she wanted it. Resources to rebuild her nursing career anywhere she chose. Simple freedom, if that was what she needed. After 3 years of running and hiding, and sacrificing everything for a child who wasn't even hers by blood, Chloe chose to build something new. "I want to start a foundation," she told him, sitting up in a hospital bed that had become, over the weeks, something closer to a war room for a project neither of them had expected. Pediatric trauma care, specifically for children affected by organized violence. Kids who can't go to a normal hospital because their families are hiding from something. Kids like Lily. There have to be more of them out there, falling through every crack in the system, because their situations are too dangerous for official channels. "I'll fund it," Damien said immediately. "You'll fund it," Chloe agreed, "but I control it. Every decision, every dollar. You don't get to buy your way into running this the way you tried to buy Lily's affection with a dozen stuffed bears." Damien actually laughed, a rare, unguarded sound that surprised them both. "Deal," he said. The romance between them, when it finally arrived, did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived slowly, the way trust arrives after it has been broken and painstakingly rebuilt. In quiet evenings reading to Lily together. In Chloe correcting the way Damien braided the girl's hair, with more patience than Damien had ever shown anyone in his life. In the comfortable silences that had replaced the wary ones. It arrived the night Chloe, fully recovered, and finally packing to move into the small apartment she'd rented near the Foundation's new offices, found Damien standing in the doorway of what had once been her small guest room, looking like a man about to lose something he'd only just learned to value. "Don't leave," he said. Chloe paused, a folded sweater in her hands. "Damien, I'm not commanding you," he said quickly, before she could mistake his meaning. "I know I have no right to. I've spent this entire relationship learning, slowly and badly, that you are not someone who takes orders. So I'm asking, please, don't leave." Chloe set the sweater down. "For years," Damien continued, his voice unsteady in a way she'd rarely heard from him, "this house was full of beautiful things I didn't care about. Marble I didn't notice. Art I never looked at twice. And then, a woman I barely acknowledged walked through it every single day, carrying the only piece of my brother the world hadn't taken from me yet, and I was too blind to see what was standing right in front of me." He crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze. "I used to believe power meant people stayed because they were too afraid to leave," he said. "You taught me the terrifying truth. Wanting someone to stay when they are completely free to go, that's so much harder, and so much more honest." Chloe's breath caught. "Damien, what are you saying?" "I love you," he said simply. Without armor, the words costing him everything and nothing at all. "I don't know when it happened. I only know it's true." Chloe searched his face for a long moment, her own heart pounding. "Do you love me?" she asked quietly. "Or do you love what I did for Lily?" Damien's answer came without hesitation, the truth of it clear in his eyes. "I loved your courage before I knew what it was protecting," he said. "I noticed you the morning you cleaned blood from my floor and told me, blood washes out. But the things people do before the bleeding stay with them. I didn't understand what was happening to me then. I only knew I couldn't stop watching you. Couldn't stop wondering what made a woman kneel in a basement full of horror and refuse to be afraid." Chloe closed the distance between them and took his hand. She chose to stay, not as a maid, not as Lily's secret protector, not as anyone's obligation or possession. As Chloe Jenkins, entirely her own. choosing him the way he had finally learned to earn. 1 year later, the Beacon Hill mansion no longer resembled the cold fortress it had once been. Chloe ran the Pediatric Trauma Foundation from a bright, sun-filled office 2 blocks from the harbor, her restored nursing credentials framed on the wall beside photographs of the first dozen children the foundation had already helped. Kids pulled from dangerous situations, treated quietly and thoroughly, given the kind of second chance Chloe herself had once given a burned 3-year-old in a stolen bathtub. Tommy Callahan testified against the surviving remnants of the O'Rourke organization and against what remained of Leo's network, trading his testimony for a reduced sentence and a quiet, watched life somewhere far from Boston's old battlegrounds. Damien had, to his own surprise, found something like forgiveness for the man who had once planted the bomb that shattered his family. A complicated, uneasy peace built on the 90 seconds Tommy had spent saving a child instead of running. Lily officially returned to the Gallion family, her existence no longer a secret to be hidden, but a truth to be protected in the open. Damien became her legal guardian, and the paperwork that made it official sat framed in his study beside a photograph of Liam and Nora. A reminder, finally, that could bring warmth instead of only grief. The basement office, the room where this had all begun, with bleach and copper and a bloodstained Persian rug, no longer existed in its old form. Damien had gutted it completely, replacing the dark paneling with bright white walls, installing skylights where none had been before. It had become, by unanimous vote of the household, Lily's art room, doubling as a satellite office for Chloe's foundation work on the evenings she wanted to stay close to home. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Lily, now 6, her green eyes bright with concentration, knocked over a jar of red paint while working on a canvas nearly as tall as she was. The paint spread in a wide, vivid stain across the pale wooden floor, exactly where the old bloodstains had once lived before Damien had the boards replaced. Damien, standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee, went very still, staring down at the red pooling across the floorboards. Chloe, sitting cross-legged beside Lily with paint on her own hands, glanced up and caught his expression. "Don't worry," she said, smiling. "Blood washes out." "That's paint," Damien said. "I know." Chloe's smile deepened, warm and knowing, as Lily giggled and dipped her brush back into the spilled color, entirely unbothered by the mess she'd made. But some things deserve to stay. Damien looked at the red stain on the floor of the room that had once held his worst nightmares, and then at the woman sitting in the middle of it, covered in paint, laughing, with the child she'd carried through 3 years of hell to bring safely home. He thought about the morning he'd found her scrubbing blood from his floorboards, certain she was hiding something. He had been right. She had been hiding something, not a betrayal, not a theft, but the one thing his empire, with all its wealth and violence and power, had never been able to buy back. His family. Somewhere between a blood-stained basement, a child's bright green eyes, and the Curvy Maid his household had once quietly mocked and completely underestimated, the most feared man in Boston had finally found the one thing worth more than everything he'd built, a reason to come home. If you were in Chloe's position, do you think you could have trusted Damien enough to reveal the truth about Lily? Knowing everything he was capable of? Could you forgive Tommy for planting the bomb, knowing he was also the reason Lily survived it? And at what moment in this story did you first suspect Leo was the real traitor? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a slow-burn mafia romance. with a heart underneath the darkness. More stories like this one are coming, so stay close.